Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Ohio by Stephen Markley. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into a spoiler-free overview of the plot, talk about what I liked about the book, what I didn't like about the book, who I'd recommend the book to, and I'll probably finish up there. I'm not quite sure what I'll be reading for next time. Stephen Markley is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. He also has written some nonfiction work. It looks like he has a couple memoirs. And he's also, since his time, has written a book called The Deluge, I believe, which looked pretty interesting. It's more about climate change in the next 20 or 30 years. This book, Ohio, came out in 2018 and got relatively good reviews. It is about a small fictional town in Ohio called New Canaan. And the book is looking at one night in 2013 where four high school classmates are back in town and kind of the interweaving of their stories as they reconnect. Most of them have left the town and are back in the town for kind of personal reasons. And the book kind of explores the effects of deindustrialization on this town and how there's not really a lot left in the town. And I thought that it was really well written in terms of Stephen Markley's use of analogy and metaphor. I think his sentence-to-sentence work was quite strong. There's some really moving pieces of writing in the book. So I was really impressed by his skills as a writer, just on kind of a sentence-to-sentence level. I think that there are a couple characters that he could have easily turned into hypocrites, and I appreciated that he didn't do that. The characters, for the most part, are kind of scumbags, for lack of a better term. I think he tries to show realistic psychology behind each of his characters, which I appreciated. I think he writes the male characters a little bit stronger than the female characters. But the book is basically about these characters' lives in between the time they graduated high school in the early 2000s to this moment in 2013 when they're kind of back in town, and kind of looking at the effect of this time in high school, how it formed them, how the people around them, how they made these decisions based on this time in high school. So kind of on the things that I thought were maybe a little less strong. I thought the book was a little bit long. I think that, like I said, there's some characters that are maybe less interesting than others. I think his male characters are more interesting than his female characters. I found that the conceit where these characters are all kind of back in town, each one of the characters kind of has this lost love in their lives, and that felt a little repetitive by the second or third time that you read that story. And you kind of, as the book goes along, you kind of see the weaving of the history of these characters. And I think he does a good job of portraying different jumps in time, so forward in time, backwards in time. I thought that was done really interestingly. If you're someone who graduated high school around this time, I think he does a really good job. This is probably the most, like, if you graduated between the year 2000, high school in 2000 and 2004, this is probably the closest book that I've read as a novel that's kind of close to that feeling. And it really struck home for me. I didn't grow up in Ohio or anything, but I felt that there's a little bit of a universality there that I appreciated. The plotting, I thought was, there's some characters, the way, I should say, the way the structure of the novel works, there's an opening prologue that's essentially a funeral for one of the characters in the novel. And from that point forward, you have these chunks of about 100 pages for four main characters who we follow really throughout the rest of the book. And then there's something of an epilogue. There are several mysteries, and I think he does a really good job of kind of when to release information and when not to release information that was really, I think, keeps you propelled through the book. There wasn't a point in time where I was like bored, but there are some times where he ends chapters in kind of ambiguous ways that I didn't really appreciate. And I think some of the characters were just less interesting than other characters. And so you're spending quite a lot of time with some of these characters where you're just like, I'm not really that interested in this character's story. And it also matches this other, the arc of the story kind of matches similar arcs in the book. And many of the characters have similar arcs in their storylines. And so I was kind of put off by that. The book overall is just kind of how, and for lack of a better term, this generation was essentially wasted. And he has one of the characters who's an Iraq war veteran and his experience in the war and how that's followed him home. There are characters, many characters and side characters and secondary characters who are have committed suicide or on drugs, heavy drugs, and sometimes a combination of both of those things. And so some of the secondary characters or tertiary characters just really weren't that interesting to me. There's a character in particular who's a songwriter in the novel who just kind of came off as bland and uninteresting. And anytime that you're writing lyrics of songs that are fake songs, you kind of run into an issue of, does this sound interesting or does this not sound interesting if it's not based on a real song? I did like a lot of the cultural touch points in the book. There's a character in the Iraq War, and one of his COs is basically a big fan of early 2000s, late 1990s pop music, and so that's kind of a running joke for a little bit. I enjoyed that. The book is very, very, very dark, and so I will say, if you're someone who liked Hurricane Season, which is a book that I've read in the past, I had a little bit of touch of Empire Falls, the Russo book. I think that there's another book. I think it was the Encyclopaedist. I'll leave the link below, but I reviewed a book a long time ago that was basically very, very similar in the sense that it's kind of talking about this time period and talking about the lives of these characters through the eyes of these events. 2008 and the financial crisis and 9/11 kind of are these long shadows over the book, and those kind of feed into different things. I would say the main criticism of the book is I think the book starts out really, really strong, and there's a character who's like the centerpiece of the first chapter of the book, and I enjoyed that character. I thought he was interesting. This is basically the prologue. In that character's life, kind of, and his family and all these things kind of reverberate throughout the book, and I enjoyed that part of it. And the end of the book is really focused on another character who I just found just to be infinitely less interesting, and I thought that character, the way that storyline kind of gets wrapped up, there's a lot of holes that just don't make a lot of logical sense. There's a character who is, while they're trying to give the underlying psychology of this character, this character almost comes off as almost like a Bond villain in a way, who just like enjoys the chaos everywhere that they go. And I felt that was a little dodgy, because I think even in high school, that would get understood and noticed, and that there would be more ramifications of this character's actions. I also think that many people leave their hometowns and come back to their hometowns throughout their lives, and the idea of everyone kind of having a lost love from high school to me is like not a universal thing. And so the level of maturity for some of these characters was a little bit, that's kind of the conceit of the book, and it kind of to me stretched credulity a little bit, where it was like every single character is this way that we're following. So I would have liked to have some variety in the plot. I think he's a really strong writer, and it'd be interesting to see what he does next. I thought, like I said, some of the passages were very strong. I felt that the stuff that he's writing when he was writing about the war scenes, I thought were really, really well done. I wish there had been more variety. I do like that there are characters that I think he could have taken down and made them really, really one note and really, really obnoxious. There's the friendship between three characters in particular, one of whom is the character whose prologue kind of opens the book. That friendship was really, really interesting to me, and the further we got away from this group of friends, the less interesting maybe it was. But I thought that he kind of has these stories of like small town America that were really interesting, and I think he does a good job of weaving in a bunch of like several different characters. The other book, The City on Fire, would also be another kind of touch point here. I will say I would consider this book a relatively hard R. So there's a lot of trigger warnings that I'll just go now. Suicides happen in the book. There is self-harm that happens in the book. Really pretty graphic detail of self-harm that kind of took me back. There's moments of war where people are killed. There is usage of substances while someone is pregnant. So it's a really, really relatively dark book. Like I said, it's kind of on the tone of Hurricane Season. And so if you read that and were just really put off by the tone, you're probably not going to appreciate this. I wish there's small tweaks with this book that I wish he had made that I think would have made it a lot stronger. Maybe I'm harsher on it than I normally would be. It is quite long, and I think that there's one character in particular that I think he found maybe two characters, both of whom were female characters, one of whom's chapter kind of comes in the first half, and the ending chapter kind of focuses on another character. And neither one of those characters I found to be particularly interesting. But this will probably resonate with a lot of people if you're from a small town and have this like idea of kind of this the interweavings of these characters and kind of watching the kind of story of this town through these eyes of these characters. I thought was really interesting. I wish there had maybe been a little bit more variety. There doesn't seem to be any of the characters who kind of get out, which also stretched the credulity a little bit for me. So there's not a lot of happy endings in the book. So if you're looking for characters with a happy ending, this is not the book for you. But I think for a debut novel, I was really impressed by it. I probably will look into reading his other book. I'm hoping that some of those things, some of those skills you grow with time. Excuse me. So some things like the plotting and maybe having more variety in the characters and the arcs of the story. And also the ending kind of felt a little bit like, well, I now have to kind of throw this thing in here and try to make this interesting when it really maybe there were other ways that they could have ended the book that would have tied in maybe more to the beginning of the book, the characters that I had more interest with. But that is Ohio by Stephen Markley. I did see a note that they are trying to adapt this, possibly adapt it into an HBO series. I think that would be interesting. Yeah, if you've read this, I know it's a few years old now, but feel free to leave comments below. Like I said, I don't know what I'm going to be reading, reviewing for next time. But if you have any recommendations, feel free to throw those below. Until next time, bye.